Hey folks, quick word about this episode. It's got some slightly rough audio due to me learning the ropes. I would have gone ahead and re-recorded this episode, but I think some of the conversation here is really quite good and I didn't want to reset it, so apologies for the bad audio quality, but I hope you enjoy the content nonetheless.
Good morning, people of the internet. You are listening to Debi Radio 79.5 FM, a Movies by Minute podcast where we discuss Grosse point blank, 1 minute at a time. I'm Hugh.
And I'm Dev. And on today's show, we're going to be looking at minute 2, starting with the very end of the opening credits and ending with a rendition of the high school reunion letter by the wonderful Joan Cusack.
Absolutely. Joan Cusack, absolutely national treasure, I think, in America, yes?
You know what? I think the entire Cusack family has contributed so much to my enjoyment of life in the form of film. And the fact that there are 3 Cusacks in this movie makes me very, very happy.
I mean, it's interesting she was nominated for 2 Oscars, although she's not won. That's kind of interesting. I always assumed she was like, she just got one. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
She got a supporting role nom for Best Actress in a Supporting Role for Working Girl in '89, and then in '98 for gay rom-com In and Out with Kevin. Flipping heck, what's his name? Guy who was in Fish Called Wanda, Kevin.
Oh
Kline.
God, Kevin Kline. That's it.
That's it, Kevin
Yeah,
Kline.
I was stuck on the same name that it definitely wasn't as you were, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, but I'm, she got nominated for that, and funnily enough, that was another Hollywood Pictures film.
And I know we're already off on a pretty hardcore tangent, but you definitely need to watch the Hallmark movie that she's in because it's actually pretty phenomenal.
Okay, so for listeners who are new to Dev and I as friends, this is a thing that we've been discussing of late because Dev's wife is an expert in Hallmark films. I think is a fair comment. Would you say?
Certainly an enthusiastic fan, yeah. Let's go with
that. Is that better, worse than an expert?
I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure I'm dead either way, but we'll go with it.
Hey, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I told you I've done a podcast before on a Hallmark film. Yeah. I have 3 podcasts under my belt from the last 5 years. So any listeners who are looking around for who we are will find my name attached to a couple of others. One of which is a history-based podcast, in which my co-host there, we look at historical films and talk about the historical elements. And we decided for fun for a Christmas episode, we would watch a Hallmark film that involves a time-traveling knight who supposedly is traveling from Norwich to America.
Yeah,
except
you see,
Norwich,
I'm telling you that a Hallmark movie with both Joan Cusack and Danny Glover in it is going to be significantly better. Yeah,
I love Danny Glover.
I know. I just needed to fit that in to really sell it.
Nice, very nice.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal, phenomenal movie by Hallmark Christmas movies standards, and I do actually quite enjoy the other Hallmark movies. So,
I mean, ain't nobody saying there's anything wrong with them.
I mean, there's a lot wrong with them, but that doesn't stop them being enjoyable.
Okay, now that's out of the open.
And to be fair to them, they are trying to address some of the gaping flaws with the genre as a whole. So, credit to them on trying.
Fair enough. Is it called Let It Snow?
No, I actually just sent you the link. It's called The Christmas Train.
Oh, okay, interesting. I'm trying to think of somebody else who's made as much of a career as she has out of being. There's a few people from like the 80s and 90s who kind of settled into supporting roles, if you know what I mean. Like, I don't want to call her the best friend because that was like the term for the rom-com thing, right? The best friend actress. But
yeah, absolutely. No, I feel like she actually has quite a lot in common with Angela Lansbury in some funny ways. Now, Angela Lansbury tends to be much more of a leading role, obviously with Murder, She Wrote in particular. But that woman who constantly gets cast as somebody who's quite significantly older than she actually is, that
Mm.
Angela Lansbury kind of resigned herself to fairly early on. I feel like
Hmm.
Joan Cusack kind of got put into the same kind of bucket and rocks it in exactly the same way as Angela Lansbury.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. I think I've never heard her put in the same breath as Lansbury, and that is so appropriate, so perfect. Yeah, absolutely. I will completely 100% go with that. Um, I am intrigued by sorry, I don't want to go down rabbit holes, but I am intrigued as a horror fan. I'm intrigued by the fact that the Christmas Train is directed by a guy who started out on Prom Night 2 as a director.
I did not realize that.
Just he's done nothing but Hallmark films for like ages now, and it is always funny where people start. Like, horror is a beloved genre for a number of reasons, but where people go from that genre is always fascinating. So coming back to Grosse Point Blank and the cast, because this is the minute we're on. We are on minute number 2. And we finished minute number 1 without even talking about the cast because we were talking about production and the director. So let's talk about cast briefly because we've got a lot of other things to cover in minute 2. But just briefly, we mentioned Joan Cusack, who is American National Treasure, and John Cusack, who I feel like this is. Everyone says High Fidelity is the quintessential John Cusack film, which he made after this. I think this is the quintessential John Cusack film.
I agree, and I think we both might be a little bit biased because um, for us being British, I'm making an assumption here, but um, when I hear the term high fidelity with regards to not the audio equipment per se, I actually
Mm.
think of the Nick Hornby novel, right? That
Yeah.
the movie is based off of, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that book was quite as big of a hit in the US as it
No.
was in the UK. And in the UK, Nick Hornby had several very, very big successes.
Yep.
Fever Pitch, which was also made into a movie, High Fidelity, probably being the two biggest ones. And
I
so,
mean, About a Boy did pretty well afterwards.
oh yes, also true.
Yeah.
But because of that, I struggle to think of it in terms of the movie. And I've seen the movie, and it's fine. I personally feel that it lacks some of the elements of the book, partly because it is done by Americans in America, which I think it just doesn't work as well. And I often feel that way, like Girl on the Train. I had the same kind of frustration with, despite them doing a fairly good job at translocating it.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and so for me, Grosse Point Blank has no other baggage to it. It's a film that exists on its own, and
Mm.
it obviously he's got writing credits for it. He is the lead actor in it. It really does feel like his baby in a way that something where I know it from a previous incarnation just doesn't hold true.
I mean, GPB is an original, right? You and I are recording this in an era of maximum carnage when it comes to remaking, rebooting, reusing IP. Right? IP is more important than original script writing, as several of my producer friends will tell you. And I think, but I mean, that's not how they like it. That's just how it is, right? I think it's interesting that the when it comes to something like Grosse Point Blank, I can't imagine. I'm trying to think of something recent that is similarly, yeah, independent production, first time production by a movie star with some cachet, but not necessarily the cachet necessary to pull a film like this off. Director who at that point hadn't made a film in 7 years either. You know, English actress on her way up, not yet a big star. Do you know what I'm saying? It's just
I think the only area you can find anything like that anymore is the horror genre. I think there's
yes,
still scope for it in horror because horror is traditionally small budget. A success or a failure doesn't really matter. If you get one success in 100, you're probably paying off all the failures as well, and
yeah.
and those are pretty good odds.
Yeah.
So you can get away with this kind of stuff in that genre. In
Yes.
almost everything else, movies have become too big to fail, and
Yeah.
because they're too big to fail, they have to, play it safe in every regard.
I mean, I've seen a few. I mean, there are still a handful of mid-budget action as made for streaming, or to clean up on DVD slash whatever equivalent what's left of the home video market. But majority of those tend to be not as well written as Grosse Pointe Blank. I mean,
Yeah.
thinking of oh, I'm thinking of a couple of films recently by Scott Adkins called The Debt Collectors, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and they're low budget actioners, but they're very well put together, and they're actually quite well written and quite funny. They kind of they're not a million miles away from the tone of what we're looking at here, but they're much more rough and tumble because they're about people who collect debts from dodgy people. It's not. It doesn't have. There's a degree of sophistication to Grosse Pointe Blank. The jokes require not education, but there is wit rather than simply jokes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this harks back to one of the reasons I love it, right?
Mm,
It's not explaining to the basis audience in the way that films have a habit of doing. It
mm,
will make a joke, have a throwaway line. You may get it, you may not, but things happen so quickly that you're not going to dwell on it. You're just going
mm,
to move with things. And if all you get out of it is the action and the visual stuff, you're still going to
mm-hmm,
come out happy. And if you pick up the one-liners and the ad libs and the little references here and there along the way,
mm,
all the better. And that's
mm.
incredibly hard to pull off.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. And even though now looking back on it, it seems like it was easy to do because the '90s are full of this stuff, right? I mean, Pulp Fiction heralds its success at Cannes. And let's be honest, its success in Cannes is mostly because Clint Eastwood was the head of the jury that year. And as a number of people, including Clinton himself, said when asked, because the jury was split on it, and he cast the deciding vote, and he said, "Oh, it's the kind of film I'd like to think I would have made when I was young," kind of thing. I think I seem vaguely recall him saying that in an interview on French TV, but uh, and I disagree. I don't think he'd have made that when he was young. I think he'd have made a much better version of the film. But I know what he means. The kind of the and I think and that obviously set off a buying frenzy and a production frenzy, and people, we had this whole boom in American comedy crime or crime with a comedy element, or but also the music, the deliberate juxtaposition and contrast of pop music and lighthearted music with violence, as the beginning of this film does as well.
Yeah.
And which is such a staple that now James Gunn can pull that rubbish in a Guardians of the Galaxy, and everyone goes, "Oh, that's fine. It's a Disney film with the 12A." And oh, look, he's slaughtering like an entire crew to pop music, and you're going, "Really? This is what we do now at 12A?" Anyway, but Guns from the '90s, that's normal for him. That's how he does things. So I think in that sense, looking back on it, you think, oh yeah, that was everyone was doing it, that was normal, and actually no, you realise it was actually hard work for Cusack to pull this off, because it isn't just the combination; it's the tonal balance of Grosse Pointe Blank is insanely. It's a perfect knife edge of you know just this balance, this high wire act,
Yeah,
and the
absolutely.
opening scene has it straight away. It's
Yeah.
fast. It's relatively fast cut. Things are set up very quickly. You're in media res. There's dialogue already. Conversations are happening. Clearly, guns already being prepped. Violence is around the corner. Um,
And this is something that I'd not really thought about until you and I were discussing how we were going to record this show. Um, that the protagonist in this is a psychopath. Like, I mean, they are almost textbook definition of a psychopath, and yet they are a character that we relate to very, very quickly and very, very strongly. And to pull that off is something that is kind of scary that it's been done so well.
I question. Okay, this is going to sound very, very weird. I question whether or not he truly is a psychopath. I know that's the joke of the film, right? Is he says he is, right? But he spends the entire film trying to move beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, he says the exact opposite, right? He says, like, I'm not a psychopath. A psychopath kills for no reason. I kill for money.
Yeah, but you know that what he means is, yes, I am. I just have a license to do it.
Exactly, and I think you're right. Like it falls into the same pitfall as Dexter did, right? Where the character ultimately ends up not performing to the prognosis of the original character.
But I think that's the point. I think the whole point, of course, from like for me at least, in terms of character arc and emotional development, and I think this is why it's interesting that it's seen as such a Midwest film, and it's his background, and it's his mates who are co-scripting it. Which, by the way, they also worked on the adaptation of High Fidelity, which explains why these two films are so similar, and also explains why, for you and me, as an adaptation, it doesn't necessarily really work as well as it should. But I think it's less about being. I mean, you say he's a psychopath. I see. I mean, maybe it's because I work with too many people who are ex-military now. I don't know. I feel like he is somebody who's been taught how to behave in a certain way. He now earns a living from it. But I don't get the impression, unlike the other character we meet very, very soon, next minute, played by Dan Aykroyd, I don't think... Now, I think, is truly psychopathic. Because he will do absolutely horrific things, and you can see that there's a degree of relish in it. It comes back to this... So there's this really weird thing in movies about the notion of... And this goes back all the way... Like, even, going back to Melville's Le Samouraï in the 60s, but even before that, the idea of the professional killer, right? I don't do this because I like it. I do it because it's a talent and I'm good at it. And it's a skill. I'm trained at it and I enjoy it. And that's the, it's not so much enjoyment, but, I do it, right? But the problem is where is that line? Okay. Where is that line between you, the person, and the person you have been trained to be? Because to my way of thinking is, and again, looking at 90s cinema, the real psychopaths are the ones with no ability whatsoever to connect. One of the reasons I absolutely adore his speech in the final scenes, and again, we'll have to say this for later when we get there, but when he's trying to explain himself while in the middle of a massive gunfight to his, ex-girlfriend. And it's like, but the point is he's trying to do that. And I feel like that's the thing that makes him not a psychopath. A psychopath wouldn't even bother with any of the emotional arc in this film.
And this movie relies on that redemption arc, I guess.
I think it does because like he says, Uncle Sam taught me to be this. There's an interesting subtle commentary there on militarization and
Yes, I mean certainly encouraged it. I think the fact that he describes himself on prom night as wanting to kill somebody, and that's why he joins the army. Like, I mean, there was definitely a seed of something before that.
But you and I, I'm sorry, but that's relatable. It's not, it's not about being psychopathic. That's about being a teenager. That's about being a teenager with more hormones than sense, right?
That is true. And I was going to say, I'm not sure I've ever wanted to kill someone so badly as to join the army. But I would say that I think for a lot of young people in certain parts of America, that does sometimes feel like the best career path.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although I think that argument breaks down. I'm just arguing against myself at this point, which makes for a great video. But,
I love this. I can just set you going, and I'll let you finish. Do both sides of the argument. Off you.
Yeah, I'll just talk with my other self, right? Like no psychosis here. This is set in Grosse Pointe, right? This is a very, very
Michigan.
wealthy suburb of Detroit, Michigan, right? At the
Mm.
time, this is still a Detroit that's maybe not in the prime of
Oh God, no! This is Elmore
Motor
Leonard,
City,
Detroit. Yeah,
but
this is not a great place.
Grosse Point is still living fat off of that wealth, right?
Yeah.
And these kids going to Grosse Point High, for the most part, have probably got pretty good outcomes, I would suspect. So I think the argument that the army seems like a good option, maybe,
Well, I
but
didn't
it's
say it was a
harder
good
to
option.
see.
He says that, right? He says it's a good option. The
Hmm.
point is, he doesn't. He's like, oh, I have this rage to do something.
Yeah.
Therefore, I should go get this job, which we both know is the kind of logic of teenage boys, right? It's not.
Maybe.
It does. Well, I teach them now. Trust me. This is this is the logic. Like, oh, I'm not saying it's logical. I'm just saying this is the internal logic of that age range and that time. It's like, I really want to kill her. Going, oh, maybe I'd make a game. And I just feel like I don't think he was naturally a psychopath. I think he's a classic punk outsider, different from everyone else. So he thinks he is. Goes away, gets turned into a killing machine. And now he's at that point and this is where the arc is so interesting, because this is the arc most of us go through in relation to certain jobs and careers. Because he's at that point where he's like, I've been doing this a while now, and I'm starting to think maybe this is why it's such a relatable film, because he's like, yeah, wait, you want me to join a union? What's going on? It's just, that's what's so clever about it, is they've given him the arc that other people he goes back to meet from where he's from would probably get if he wasn't a killer.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
the cleverness of this film,
Yeah.
is to make it sound normal as all
Yeah.
this mayhem is happening. Conversations are reasonably kind of,
Yeah.
normal for. I'm going to bring this up now rather than a later podcast, because this is something I will always come back to. One of my dear friends in media and literature has once said to me a long time ago, and this is a thing that stands me in good stead when I'm looking at the way film, TV, books, games work, is a great. He talked to me about what it is that audiences respond to inside certain characters, therefore there's a success. So, for example, the success of Fleming's Bond books in the 50s, before Kennedy then, says, yeah, this is my airplane reading, and they blow up. Let me rephrase that. And they become hugely successful. There is because you suddenly have a cadre of men in suits flying places, because flight is in now and affordable, and jetting off for jobs, and landing in different places, and suddenly going, oh, I'm here. I'm only here for one night. Who am I going to find at the bar? And that whole approach, the style of Bond as Fleming sees him, a man who flies out on jobs from his head office, gets a room in the hotel, goes for a drink, finds a pretty girl to talk up, but then he's still got a job to do.
Yeah. I mean, it's that evolution of the Doc Savage into Superman into the suave sophisticate. It's just following the cultural trend into the
Right. But what's interesting is what happens when you start to flip that on its head. And in that sense, I think that's what's clever about this film. By trying to imbue it with the fact that he's writing it with high school friends, and he's trying to imbue it with that sense of where they're from, allows him to give it an original tweak that is both simultaneously something that, yes, you want good films and books and other media artifacts to do, because it makes it relatable to you as an audience member. Because for me, the perfect example was always 24. I remember when 24 started, and everybody in the office I worked in was glued to 24. And the biggest problem with 24 is and the most unrealistic part of it, quite frankly, even with season 2 dropping a nuclear bomb a short way from LA and everyone's fine, is the fact that there's a office full of backstabbing, power hungry colleagues screwing each other over, even though they're supposed to be protecting America. And it's like, that's what most people relate to, is the office stuff. And the fact he gets to run around and torture people and shoot people because of the frustration inside the office. And there's like, that's what made that show so damn successful for so long, is amongst other things, but that's a key part of it. And I feel like Grosse Pointe Blank, I feel like Cusack, again, lightning in a bottle. This is a perfect blend of all these aspects. And this opening scene, which we haven't even laid out in detail here, we've mentioned it briefly, but this opening scene sets all of that up incredibly quickly. As I said, it's in media res. He's in a room overlooking a street in what we now know as Los Angeles. He's prepping a hit. He's got a rifle. He's got his headset on for his mobile phone, because this is the early days of mobiles, isn't it? And radio.
Yeah.
Tech. Is he actually on a radio, or is he actually on a phone? I can never remember.
I think he's on a phone. But I'm actually not entirely sure.
Yeah.
One of the things that I being the American of the two of us, I guess, the freshly
days you
born,
are.
newborn American that I am, I do feel like one of the things interesting to me in this action movie is how relatively low key the guns are for an action movie.
Okay.
I think, and this harks on to the lack of special effects, the lack of blockbusters, right?
Right.
You have one rifle, you have a few semi-automatics at the end of the game, at the end of the movie, and the Uzis, and the rest is just pistol work.
Yeah.
And that
Okay.
feels very low key by today's standards, right? And even when he's talking about ordering, because I mean the phone call is primarily to put in the order for replacement ammunition, right? For 380,000 rounds, 380,000 rounds, 357. They're both pistol grade. I mean, you don't actually see those pistols in the movie, or at least not his ones. I think there's 357s that
I mean, he's using
Grosse
Glocks most
uses,
of it.
but
Yeah, Grosse uses
he's
them.
on
Glock.
Glocks.
Yeah, which is interesting because, of course, the '90s is when things like the Glock became more visible to the public eye and made it into the movies. You go back to the '80s, and you're mostly looking at big American classic handguns, and it's about firepower and flashiness and showing off.
Yeah.
There's a reason these were still making Dirty Harrys in the '80s.
Yeah, and the
Caliber,
Rambos,
yeah, and then of course we had Rambo, as you say. Although the irony is, of course, is that Rambo's M60 isn't a real M60 because Stallone couldn't lift the real thing. He wasn't strong enough, even after the gym. They had to make a modified version for the films that was light enough for him to carry. I love that. Plus, also
yeah.
the fact that he never served in Vietnam because he was a PE teacher in a girls' school in, I think, Switzerland. So I'm just going to leave that out there for my take on Rambo. But yeah, that was the era of Arnie, because Arnie could carry the big guns, But that was the era when guns themselves started to become part of the attraction of films. I remember buying an issue of Guns and Ammo precisely because it featured all these TV and films that I was into at the time, and they went through all the guns. And for some reason, I know that, and I don't like. Why do I know that? There's no need to know that. And this film, this film doesn't do that. But as you say, it keeps it very low key. But the other thing that's interesting about this is assassination. In theory, is about two things. It's either, in theory, it's about making it look like it's natural, or it's making it obvious because you want the people who are related to the person hit to know it's happened, right?
Right.
And in that sense, starting off with him using a rifle makes sense. The pistol stuff's interesting because you have to be up close and personal to a degree. It's not quite knife work.
But also, I think the other thing with assassination is it is killing in a civilian context, right? Which means that you need to be able to get out again, at least if you want to be able to do it again.
Yeah.
And that's where the pistol
Hitman
comes in, right? Pistols are concealable, but I think they could have still brought in the big guns quite easily. You've got scenes where he's talking about the Gulf. You've got scenes where he's talking about the T-34s in Vietnam or Korea.
Yeah.
Those could have so easily been flashback sequences, and I think in
Mm.
most movies these days they would have been,
Oh, of course, because these
right?
days, the hero has to be trained, and part of the hero worship of the military that is very much more common where you are than it is here, although it's here too. And it's like you have to make your hero have some link to professionalism, because people are like, oh, I don't know how he'd know how to shoot otherwise. It's not like the '60s where Joe Random is, or '70s rather, where Joe Random is suddenly the victim of a conspiracy but still knows how to use a gun, kind of thing, right?
Yeah,
It's come a long way. But actually, I prefer the fact that they don't show us that. I prefer that they don't, because it allows for an intensity of action that is more in keeping with, at that point, what was still fresh to westernized John Woo and Hong Kong stuff, because it's about rounds fired
yeah.
rather than the gun itself. Because
Although the next minute will get us into that a
yeah,
little bit.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So what else? So yeah, making a hit. We haven't talked about where. I'm going to bring that up briefly, and we haven't finished on the actors, but we've covered Joan and we covered John. We can talk about Minnie and Alan later. I think
Yes,
if
and
we're talking
I
about the
mean, I
four
think
main people.
it's a relatively small cast. I think we're going to have plenty of time to talk about them as
Okay,
as they
well,
feature in the movie as well.
I
Um,
have a daughter. I actually saw Minnie Driver in the first short film that she did, because the short film got nominated for, I think, a BAFTA and an Oscar, and it was back in the day when you could still see shorts on TV, and I saw it late night on Channel 4 randomly, and I was just like, she's a great actress. I'm going to follow her. And that was like, yeah. So I will definitely going to talk about that for later. But let's just talk briefly about the actual location in question, because we discovered when we were researching for this podcast that this is a very familiar location. And so the scene is it's downtown Los Angeles. It is the Millennium Biltmore Hotel, which is still around, owned by Millennium Hotels. Is very, very famous. It's featured in tons of movies and TV, but the bit that they use is not the bit everyone knows, which is the frontage. They're actually using the rear entrance,
yeah,
which is South Grand Avenue.
it
And
says
yeah,
something about a hotel when the rear entrance is quite as swanky and fancy looking as that. Because I mean, there are some seriously fancy hotels in New York that have frontages that are about as swanky as that one is.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And interestingly enough, it's next door to a restaurant that was featured in Chinatown. For those of you who like your Polanski classics, and that's a nice, neat reference, because, of course, Chinatown was an update of noir style for the '70s. Noir in color.
Yep.
Noir with more violence, more blood. Yeah, so it's an appropriate nod. This is even if it's unintentional, it's a nice piece of connective tissue.
Yeah,
Um,
and
you know,
actually, that noir vibe kind of takes us to the other
yeah,
set in this scene, which is where Joan Cusack is sitting, which is as we find out later, his office,
mm,
um, which is wood paneled, basically a 2-room office space in presumably some kind of large shared office building,
yeah.
of a style that I can't really conceive of ever having existed, although I'm sure it must have done. Um, but one
Wait,
thing that, yeah,
what do you mean you can't conceive of it? This is interesting. I want to know what you
because
mean by that.
I've grown up in open plan
Oh, of
modern
course you
office
have.
buildings.
Right.
Yes, I can think of like hip loft spaces, converted loft spaces, and I can think of you know office space, literally like the movie Office Space style offices,
Mm, mm,
but this kind of old wood paneled office that I somehow assume is always in New York or Chicago.
mm.
Uh, they literally exist for me in this film, a few TV shows, and then predominantly like the film noir genre, right, where it's a 2-room office with uh, the entry space, which is where
Reception and main.
the reception in the main office,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which
Yeah.
brings me to the other really interesting point about that office, which is he set it in reverse. She sits in the main
Explain.
office and he sits at the reception desk.
God, that's true. Whoa.
Now, there's an argument to be made that it's because she's the one who's actually there the majority of the time. But I honestly
Right.
think that there might, like, there's an element of that where it's very much a case of he would feel uncomfortable being the boss, because that's
Yeah.
not the way that he thinks.
Well, it also goes back to this idea of what we think, what you think people in his line of work do and how they behave, right? Again, this is the kind of playing with the reality of it. Is she's his support. She's both his simultaneously his handler and his in the field support. So he sees her as the person in charge, but client facing wise, he's still the guy that they want to know is going to do the job.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can see that. I can see
I,
that. Also, like, he wants his back to the wall as opposed to the windows as it would be in the
yes,
office. And he wants
yes,
to be close to the exit. And those are both
yes.
those themes that he kind of speaks to at various points in the movie.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. That's really interesting. But also that gives, and that quite subtly gives Joan Cusack greater power symbolically. Um, while this works to his strengths, it also shows you his insecurities, and it also shows you her strengths.
Yeah.
And so people watching the film, if they don't pick up on it consciously, are subconsciously going to go,
Yeah.
she's the boss.
Yeah.
Because she's
Although
only,
I don't think that illusion lasts very long.
no, it doesn't. But I think it's interesting that the relationship between them is similar to that era of film you're discussing. There's a certain, it's not quite his Girl Friday, but there's a certain fast talking male female. I'm doing everything that you need done because you need done because you don't know how to do it and you can't do it. But still, I need you to be doing the job. Otherwise, I don't have a job. Yeah, there's a certain dynamic there
Yeah.
that is, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, there's a version of this film in another dimension that was shot by the Coen brothers.
I'm not sure I want to see it, but I can see
No,
it.
no, but I'm just saying
I
that
can
that
perceive it. Yeah. Yeah.
that's very much in their wheelhouse. The whole neo noir, updating it, keep having the dialogue have that snappiness of the 40s and 50s,
Yeah.
and the playing with the roles. That's very Coen Brothers.
Yeah.
And again, I don't mind mentioning that because I think Armitage ought to be mentioned in that. I think if he had a broader filmography and a wider set of films, he might be mentioned in the same breath.
Yes, I think you're right.
But
Yeah, I do.
So yeah. So you want to talk about the next bit, as it were, within this minute. So Cusack, Jones talking to John. John's busy trying to get ready. So Martin Kublak is getting ready to shoot, where the victim is coming down the street outside the hotel. We're
And I
in
think this
LA.
takes us to the cyclist, right?
Yeah.
So I think the cyclist will get a little bit more time in the next minute, but the
Okay.
credit that pops up on screen as the cyclist is coming down the street towards the hotel is that the original score is composed by the one and only Joe Strummer of The Clash, which I don't know how deep we want to go into this because I know we're hoping to
Not.
do minutes
Yeah.
in the future, really
I think we
focused
should
on the
save it.
music.
Yeah. But
But
let's say it now, guys. If you don't know, if you're young enough not to know who the Clash are, which is possible, okay. I mean, I know I have to say that I'm a secondary school teacher. I'm so used to people not knowing certain things.
sad but true.
Very true. So one of the most important bands in British punk, there's the Sex Pistols, who are the Rolling Stones, and then there's the Clash, who are the Beatles in that context. Of that era in terms of creativity and style and just everything. And the Clash were the more political ones, and they were the more adventurous ones musically, and they changed a lot of people's lives and defined a lot of people's version of what was punk. Because they were still there as things moved into new wave, and before they broke up, they were trying different things. And Joe Strummer was the lead singer, songwriter, guitarist. had something of an interesting and unusual solo career. And he was a hero to many because of his outspoken politics as well. And yeah, just
and
an important guy.
And in the case of this movie, I think the music or the soundtrack and the score are so core to what make this such a great movie, and why we think of this as, not just a precursor to High Fidelity, but I think in a lot of ways superior to High Fidelity.
Agreed. I mean, I think that's also because this film fundamentally addresses something that High Fidelity doesn't, and that's a particularly toxic version of nerd masculinity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
Although I don't feel like High Fidelity should address that directly. I think that. I mean, if you're thinking of it in terms of the book, it is a film. We really need to stop talking about High Fidelity. But
is that our next one?
It's. I mean, the toxic masculinity is just the running theme of Nick Hornby's novels.
No, absolutely, I don't dispute that. But what I mean is, in terms of Cusack.
Fair, yeah.
I feel like this is cleverer because it gets into the whole notion of Americans, violence, guns, army. I think, and suburbia. The dream, the thing at the home. I think it's all. Yeah, I think it's. People often praise the final shots of The Hurt Locker, where Jeremy Renner is like overwhelmed by the range of choice in the supermarket, and everything that's at home, and next thing you know, he's going back. And it's like this film there is something of that tonality in this film, and something of that sense of what did I leave behind? Why did I leave it behind? Except that here, there's a realization about hey Tilly, there's a realization of cameo by Dev's dog. There's a realization, that maybe there is something to be home for, and what is at home has value.
Yeah, and that's, yes, I think that's true, and it's one of the many reasons I love this film is that there is actually some optimism. There is a note of hope in this movie, which I don't really feel in High Fidelity particularly, and I don't want to feel in High Fidelity because it's not the style of the film.
I think there's a reason the Jack Black version of that character from the book has become not only the thing that a lot of people remember about that film, but Jack Black has built a career on it.
Yes, yeah.
There is something weirdly more acceptable about the degree to which he is nerdy and proud of what he does, even though in High Fidelity he's quite vicious about it. I think he learns to temper that. There's nobody quite like him in this film, which is interesting. I mean, Piven's character is almost, but not quite. Anyway, we'll come back to that in another episode. So, I think that's this episode.
I think you're right. This was minute 2 of the Grosse Point Blank Movies by Minute podcast, Debi Radio 79.5 FM, featuring your hosts and co-writers and co-producers, myself, Dev Sodiger, and my esteemed colleague, Hugh Kenneth David. We are available on all good podcast players.
We are also on YouTube. We're on X, aka former Twitter. Let's see how long that lasts. Spotify, at the handle @Debi Radio, as well as on the website debiradio.com. And if you're looking for those, it's spelled DEBI Radio. That's DEBI Radio.
And if you want to talk with us on Facebook, our listeners group is Debi Radio 79.5 FM Fan Club.
Sure was clear that all of this was new. Concentrating hard like a little girl, smoking for the first time.